Hi, and welcome to the first episode of Life in the Bubble. My name is Lydia, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Nate and Christa. We are so excited to share this first episode with you because homeschooling is something that we've all gone through and experienced, and it's something that we care deeply about. Tonight, we want to share some of the thoughts for why we're launching this podcast and reasons that we think that you should care. I'll just pass it over to Nate. Nate, give us a few sentences about where you live, who you are, and why you want to join tonight.
Well, thanks, Lydia. It really is a pleasure to be a part of Life in the Bubble, and really has been kind of like a dream come true. This is a project I wanted to do, and when I met you, I was just like, yes, we have to do this. So I'm really excited to be a part of it. So I live in Ohio, Northeast Ohio. I actually grew up here, and this is where I was homeschooled, not far from where I live. And the reason I want to do this is really because, as a homeschool alumni, I was homeschooled all 12 years.
Wow.
I really want to be able to help anybody who's thinking about homeschooling, or maybe who is a homeschool alumni, or is in that homeschooling kind of world. You know, I want to give a different perspective as an alumni about kind of the good and the bad of it. And I want to shed some light on maybe some dark areas, but also shed some hope that's there with it. So I'm just really excited to be able to be a part of the project, and to be able to do those things through my experiences with homeschool. So really glad to be a part of it.
Yes, that all sounds so relatable and makes so much sense.
And little known fact, so I'll introduce Krista real quick because she's actually my sister. So anybody who's joining us, want to make sure that everybody knows that right off the bat of what you're getting into here. So
Yes, that's true. I'm Krista. I live in Oklahoma. I used to live in Ohio, but I moved to Oklahoma 8 years ago. I also grew up with Nate. We were homeschooled together, but I think my experience of it, I think there's a lot that can be talked about when it comes to like the experience a lot of women experience through homeschooling and good the good effects, but also the bad effects that come from it. And so I think for me, I'm passionate about it because there's a lot of gaps that I think can be filled, and a lot of conversations that can be had that could really benefit the whole community in general. And I know that the more I talk about it with other people, the more I feel like I find people that I can relate to and connect with. And I think that's really important to get the connection with people. So
Yes.
that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited and passionate about this topic.
and Lydia, we want to know what your why is though.
Yeah,
So
that's right. That's a great question. So my name is Lydia, and I live in Austin, Texas with my husband, and I work for myself as a clothing reseller, which I really love. And homeschooling was a big part of my story. I was also homeschooled all the way through, and my experience was less extreme, I think, than your experience, which obviously we'll get into detail more about that later. But homeschooling really affected my transition into adulthood and made it really difficult for me to transition into adulthood. Um, and I recognize that like everyone, everyone's story is different, everyone's story is unique. And honestly, I just think that my homeschool experience was kind of neutral, and it didn't launch me into adulthood in the way that I thought it would. And frankly, it affected me financially, it affected my dating life, and I always thought the problem was me. And over time, I was able to kind of trace back some of the issues I was having to things that I learned in homeschooling, and more specifically, like being involved in a fundy light or fundamentalist community. And so if I can share my experience in a way that helps other people feel less alone, then I would say that's my primary motivation for just wanting to unpack some of my experience in a way that's relatable. And it seems like a lot of people are talking about homeschooling more because of the pandemic, and also, frankly, because of the Duggar family. I think that this situation with Josh Duggar really opened the opportunity for people to share the good, the bad, and the ugly of homeschool, because I think up to that point, homeschooling was kind of seen as either being really weird or really idyllic. And because of that whole situation with Josh Duggar, it kind of opened the floodgates for people to share. And then also with the pandemic, like more people are being exposed to homeschooling because they had to homeschool during COVID. And so it's a great time to be talking about it.
Oh, Lydia, question. Why did you decide to be a part of this podcast? Because you met some weird homeschoolers on TikTok, I hear.
I did meet some weird homeschoolers on TikTok. So so this time, actually about this time last year, I started my TikTok account, and that was because my therapist encouraged me to start a TikTok account. And I don't really know why I did, but I just kind of posted a couple videos. And at one point I realized, like, wow, there's a large homeschool community on TikTok. There's a whole bunch of people who graduated homeschooling, people who are ex-fundies, people who are like sharing their perspective. And so two of those people were Nate and Christa. And so like Nate reached out to me on TikTok and was like, hey, would you like to start a podcast? And I had thought about it in the past, but it never like seriously because I didn't have the skills for podcasting. But Nate, on the other hand, has lots of podcast experience. So, and then he brought in Christa as a third co-host. So I'm excited. I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
So yeah, and I think that really connects a little bit to Krista and I's childhood. Krista just wrote, kind of maybe a reason why we want to do this. We didn't really like each other, and we can get into this story. We didn't really like each other much until our teen years, and there's a point in that story that we can share. Um, but now it's kind of like linked. I would say like the last when we're pushing 20 years now, it's almost like I feel like I can't do a lot of my major product projects without a little bit of her input anymore. And she's really helped me stay grounded. And I think there's a little bit of a trauma relationship to that too. Like when you go through some of the darkness that we've been through, it's kind of like once you have an ally, you really want that ally wherever you go. And so
Yeah.
that's been really, really important to me. But and I like podcasting. I mean, I produced and Chris and I actually produced it together. Over 50 episodes of my own podcast, and I've been a guest on multiple podcasts. Um, I do a lot of guest podcasting for my cybersecurity and IT business, and that's a lot of fun. And then Krista just has a lot of experience in just social media and delivery of that stuff. So it's just been a great team environment. But uh, yeah, just seeing your content on TikTok was really like, oh, this is something that I want to do, and somebody else is doing it. And I just sometimes it's hard to like start, and you need
Mm.
somebody else to be like a little bit passionate with you to kind of build that team. And not saying that everybody's homeschooling is traumatic, but sometimes when you find a fellow member of like, you're my people, like you just click. And I think that was what really brought us together here at Lydia was just like we got it. We got each other. We
Yes.
understand kind of the struggle and with that and stuff. So and then Krista can share a little bit more about why you decided to be a part of this as well. Because I forced her to do that. I can't force her to do anything. Krista does exactly what Krista wants to do all the time.
Um, I think my purpose behind like all of this really comes down to like there's some people that have like really non-traumatic experiences with homeschooling, and then there's people who do. And so I think it's good to show both sides of it,
Mhm.
and talk about it because I think a large majority of the time, people know most of the good stuff. I really feel like that's something that's commonly talked about is like all these good things that happen and like, you know, our kids didn't get raised in the public school system. They didn't have boyfriend girlfriend drama. I don't know, like stuff like that. And but nobody really like it's like if they could do a documentary of children raised in homeschooling like they do with other documentaries, and then they jump forward 10 years and they go find those people as adults and be like, okay, let's see how you did. And
Yeah.
the truth is a large majority of us, we didn't we just kind of it was like we were just stranded out in the middle of a road in a lot of ways. Like suddenly adulthood was here, and yeah, we could work and we
Mhm.
could like make really good relationships and good work ethic, but We didn't know what we wanted to do. We didn't know why we wanted to do it. We didn't know. We really aren't always taught like boundaries on how to like not work too much or stuff like that. It goes into our friendships, it goes into our dating lives, it goes into our finances. It just spreads everywhere. And like there's this process that just does not get addressed. And so I think if you found all those adults like myself, after the process, you'd find a lot of us were stranded. And instead of like jump starting in the life, we spent the majority of our 20s trying to figure out what that even looked like, so we can now jump start into our 30s and start actually doing what we care about. And all the people that are proud of it, but it doesn't often get talked about the people that get kind of left behind, and how that whole movement as a whole really left a lot of people behind. And a lot of people are afraid to say it because we don't want to make the whole bubble look bad.
Yes. Pop the bubble.
Pop the bubble.
And I think what's ironic is that people stereotypically know what the downsides of public schooling are, because we see it in movies, we see it in shows. Like it's sort of generally known, like, oh, stereotypically, if you're in public school, you might be bullied, you might be pressured into drugs and sex, you might not find your crowd of friends. But with homeschooling, there's still so few people who have a homeschool experience, especially like us. I mean, we went all of the way through, and so there's not a lot of data for people to kind of figure out what's the experience of homeschooling and what are the different factors that impact your experience, and what are things that contribute to a good or bad homeschool experience, and how does the Christian faith play into that. And so, like you said, it's really important to share our perspective, because homeschooling is a really difficult choice to make. And so oftentimes the people who are pushing for parents to homeschool their kids are doing it from a perspective that's not balanced, and they're only pushing the good side, or they're pushing parents to disciple their kids a certain way, disciple them in the Christian faith. And so they're kind of downplaying the negative side effects, because they think that homeschooling your kids in order for them to turn out a certain way is kind of worth any negative effects. And that is not true. That is not the case.
Well, and maybe to jump off there, maybe to just grab a trail for 1 minute. You've had the TikTok for a year, Lydia, and I know there's a risk in myself of people being angry about us sharing our perspective. And the thing is, people need to realize that it's my perspective. It doesn't have to be yours.
Yeah.
I don't have to be right all the time, but it is my channel or it is my podcast, and I can say what I want because it's the internet.
That's right.
But what type of backlash, what kind of stories can you tell us about from TikTok, like for a year of talking about, 90s homeschooler is your TikTok handle.
That's right.
Everybody needs to go follow that right now.
And for the record, I still have a relatively small following. I'm still learning. I'm still learning the TikTok algorithm. And honestly, I've never had a platform on social media, so the whole thing is new to me. And especially sharing something as personal as my homeschool experience feels very vulnerable. And so I kind of have to push myself to keep sharing, because it feels selfish to kind of talk about myself. But obviously my goal is to be able to connect with others and validate their stories by sharing my own experience. But to answer your question, I think most of the negative pushback I've gotten has been from people who are homeschool parents who feel that I'm like unjustly making statements about homeschooling, about the homeschool community as a whole. And I've also gotten some pushback from people who think that I'm being too critical of my parents. And thankfully, most of my feedback, most of the comments that I've gotten have been really positive. I mean, I'd say they've been overwhelmingly positive, but if I could put the negative comments into two buckets, it would be, I'm being too critical of homeschooling, or I'm being too critical of my parents.
Well, can we just, like, for the record right here, say that we don't think many homeschool parents know how to get on TikTok?
Thank God. Woo. That is very true.
That's very true.
I kind of record my TikToks assuming that my parents will find it at some point, but that hasn't happened yet because they're not on TikTok. I don't think they know what TikTok is. So they are wonderful people. they did their best. And, there are things I wish they'd done differently. Obviously, like we have family conflicts that I'm not going to talk about online. But yeah, I mean, they did their best and they didn't know. And also, I was the oldest child. So like by the time my younger siblings were in homeschool, they had a better experience because my parents had practiced a few times on the older kids. So
That's how it
Unfortunately.
goes.
Yeah,
yeah,
so Krista's perfect because she was one of the younger ones. So.
Uh-huh. No, I just learned how to manipulate the system better because I watched all you guys make mistakes.
Well, I always explained it as I always felt like I was 2.0. So they screwed up on the first two. They redid a lot of things on me because they had a lot of extra time in between me and my older brother.
love
Uh,
that.
they had like three iterations. So, like in our family, they had the older two, which were 2 years apart. Then there were 4 years between me and my older brother. So they had time to adjust. They had me and Krista. And then Krista, is it 10 or 12
It's
years between
11 years between me
11,
and
the
yeah.
next one below you? And so they had a lot of time. And I'm not very, I don't know them very well, but dang, they're spoiled those last two. Just
Oh my
saying.
gosh. Right now, as oldest siblings, we can all talk trash about the youngest siblings.
So when they watch this, and we're really not like talking that much right now, but I'm gonna say right now, you guys are spoiled. So you got it good. But yeah, so you have a great outline here for us, Lydia. Tell us why homeschooling is important to each other. Maybe we could start with Krista on that one.
Oh
Why is
yeah.
homeschooling important to you?
Homeschool. Well, I guess what homeschooling means to me, I don't know because I think I have such a. I'm going to be really honest. I think I have such a negative outlook on it.
Mm,
I think for me, it's like when I look at it and I go, if if somebody I know is pursuing to homeschool their kids, I do have a friend who homeschools all three of her kids, and I actually feel like she's the exception to the rule, which my rule is no homeschooling at all. That's just me. But because she is not just doing homeschooling, she has her kids involved in a lot of other things, like
yeah.
outside of the house, like they're involved in the community, they're engaging like socially in public school spaces, doing public school things. um she's not depending solely on herself to like navigate three human beings through education. And I think that's really important because I think there's an idea that like parents think that they have everything that's needed to fully educate your kids. And the
Yeah.
truth is, I think if you're a really good parent, you admit that you don't have everything you need in
Mhm.
order to successfully push your child forward.
Yeah.
And I've had to admit that because I have a son who I have to take to speech therapy because he needs a little bit of extra help and I'm not everything he needs. And
Yeah.
that's okay. And so for me, I am only open to homeschooling if the people homeschooling are also making sure that other people are a part of this journey with them in the education of their children.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, I really feel like it leaves a lot open for educational neglect, even uh, emotional neglect. Like you as a single human being, you cannot expect to be able to educate your kids, feed your kids, put them to bed on time, have a good relationship with them. It's just not plausible. So I feel
Mhm.
like it really leaves a lot of gaps open for a lot of emotional and educational neglect.
Mhm.
And so for me, I'm like, absolutely not. I don't think like I don't think it is like the best choice most of the time. I think it's a good choice occasionally, but not most of the time. So that's for me where I sit in that position of the bubble.
So
Sorry, my
it
voice
sounds
keeps
like
giving out here.
you want to advocate for kids who are being homeschooled, and advocate for their needs, but you also want to advocate for kids who might be homeschooled and make sure
Right,
that they have their needs met.
right. I absolutely think it's just if you're going to walk down that road, I don't think it should be as simple as just like buying some textbooks and saying, okay, I'm your educator now, because there's no real, like, there's so much I could go back and talk about in the textbooks that we went through that we just did learn things that actually happened. There's so much we missed because it was somebody else's determination about what this education actually meant, like what history were we actually learning. And I just go, how do
Big
we,
one.
if we're gonna be allowing people to educate, and I know that this is also gonna be like a fire word, allowing people to educate. They're gonna be like, well, they're my kids. There
Mhm.
is no allowing. I should just get to educate them. And I agree with you to an extent. I understand that like each home to an extent needs to have the freedom to be able to believe and do what they need to do. But education is so important for the success of your kids and the safety of them, honestly. Your kids can't go out and have um a safe lifestyle where they know how to work in through the world without an education that like really I don't know, fertilizes them as a person.
Yeah.
And it just bothers me that people can go out and pick anything. They could literally go to like a library and pick out a bunch of like, I don't know, random books and say, this is our education. Here's a history book written by somebody we don't know. And we've decided that's your history book for the year. And I
Yeah.
just feel like that is like, there needs to be more structure around what the basis of that education looks like and what needs to be happening in order to be like, yes, this child is successfully being educated and we are now passing them on to the next grade, because
Yeah.
a lot of it's overlooked and nobody's really checking. And so a lot of things are being missed, and it
Mhm.
creates a deficit into adulthood.
So,
Yeah. Why
look
is
at this.
homeschooling important to you, Lydia?
Homeschooling is important to me because I think it's a really great opportunity for families that are able to pursue homeschooling, but it often gets co-opted by people who are trying to shape their children a certain way, usually towards the end of a certain campaign, a certain social goal. Um, I know recently a lot of people have been calling for homeschooling again because they want to pull their kids out of public school, and the schools are becoming more secular, the public schools are going downhill, we've got to homeschool our kids. And that kind of call to action is really dangerous because it doesn't consider the individual need of the child. It's totally focused on the adult's agenda. And homeschooling can be really great. Honestly, I think if my husband and I were independently wealthy, which for the record, we don't have kids yet, but I think if we were independently wealthy, we would definitely choose homeschooling above other options or some form of like Montessori schooling integration, just because it's a great option. And so it's just really, and also, homeschooling can be a really fun community to belong to. If it's a healthy community, but it just makes me really sad when it's co-opted by other people.
I think out of the three of us, I have a very interesting perspective on this. So I'm married and educated. Okay. My wife is a elementary school teacher. She has a master's in educational leadership. Like we have a lot of conversations about education. And I think that it's made me like a little bit more unique and a little bit more open to lots of different educational options because uh, my experience with homeschooling is homeschooling is a very fear-based thing. We do it as a fear or a reaction to public schooling. Like we have to homeschool because public school is so bad and the private schools aren't good. And it's so fear-based. And so there's like
Yes,
a big
very
why of like
fast.
why I care about homeschooling because I don't want people to do it because of a fear-based. I was just in a conversation and the other day because I get in these conversations all the time because I care a lot about education because I care because I don't feel like I got a good education. Okay. I care because I had to work really hard to get educated. And they were talking about this particular student and I tend to spend a lot of time around like school teachers because my wife's a school teacher, and so we have a lot of these conversations. And so they were talking about this child who had a really difficult time. Like they tried this district, they weren't getting what they were needing. And I just simply said, you know what, I think this is a really good use case for homeschool because the parent cares a lot about them and has done a lot to educate themselves. And maybe not forever, but I do think there's a use case here for a grade or two of homeschooling, or I think it could benefit the child because the parent's advocating for them. And I was like, what's coming out of my mouth? Like I've always kind of felt like I'm in a little anti-homeschooling for a long
You
time.
like shocked yourself.
Like I'm not anti-homeschooling, I'm anti-fear-based homeschooling, I'm anti like religious control homeschooling. I get the want to control everything for my child because I want my children, and I have to really have the best that I could ever give them. And I want to be able to deliver that through me. And I'm just realizing every day how imperfect I really am. Like, I don't really think I'm the best one to educate my children. Like my wife, probably because she has a lot of education about how to educate people. But even she admits the more she knows about education, the more she knows that you need to have a math specialist, you have an English specialist, a history specialist. Like it takes a lot of people to specialize in these things. And sometimes my job is just to be dad and be the disciple, just the
Yeah.
discipler, and just help shape their life and be there for the dumb things, be there for the dad, I'm having trouble with this kid at school or my friend or whatever. And not because if I'm like his teacher all day long, I feel like I'm missing a lot of that stuff. And I'm able to reinforce that. And so there's a huge spectrum. I think there's a lot of great educational options out there. Not everybody is able to serve it the same way. And so that's why homeschooling is important to me. Or I think that it's an option, but I
Hmm.
don't think that you should live in a reality where you think it's your only option because the world is so fearful and scary. There's a lot of other ways to disciple your kids and educate your kids, and you really need to look at that and not make it. So I'm very against religious homeschooling. We'll get into that in another episode. But I'm very against religious homeschooling, where you're doing
Hmm.
it because you religiously believe that this is the only way that the Bible tells us. And I'll get into theology with anybody all day long because I do not think the Bible says that we have to homeschool our children.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this podcast and you think that, I will argue with you in the comments all day long. Okay, so that's
Preach.
why I think homeschooling is important. So yeah, great. Yeah. All right. So your next point, Lydia, I love this. Who do you think we're trying to reach with that, Lydia? With this, I think
Yeah.
you have the best perspective on that.
Yeah. Who are we trying to reach? Who could this impact? Who is this podcast for? Honestly, there's so many different ways we could take this, but my first thought is that we're trying to reach the person who was homeschooled and maybe they're just struggling for reasons that they can't quite figure out. And maybe through discussing homeschooling and all of the niches and quirky things about homeschooling, maybe we would be able to help that person out of a rut. Because there's so many things that I've been able to piece together over the past several years that I can connect directly to my homeschool experience. And there are things that I thought were character flaws, but they actually were related to things that I learned in homeschooling and in the homeschooling community, like at large. So just as an example, I had a string of jobs in my 20s where I was working for people that I didn't respect, but I felt like it was my job to serve them and make their lives easier and make their businesses run easier. And I wasn't getting paid well, but I was still staying in these jobs because I felt like it was my responsibility. And over time, what I realized is that I had a very deeply instilled tendency toward obedience, like obedience to authority figures. And I didn't think that I could leave those jobs because I felt responsible to my bosses or to my manager. And once I figured that out, it felt like this huge light bulb moment because I hadn't been able to see it clearly up to that point. But once I realized, like, oh, I don't owe them obedience. And I'm using air quotes, but that's what it felt like. I felt like I had to obey my boss rather than saying, oh, I'm in a job market, I'm an adult, I can find another job, right? Like I can leave this job. But that like level of intense obedience was just so deeply ingrained in me as as someone who had grown up in the homeschool community where obedience is really important. And I just, I had to put the pieces together as an adult. So that's just one example. you
Well,
know, one example
wrestling
of,
can go so many like dangerous directions. Sorry, that's like freaking me out. Like the obedience to the pastor or the church elders, or
Mhm.
the obedience to your husband,
Ooh,
to the point of like domestic violence stuff, like just like freaks me out how over the top that stuff got, you know,
yes.
like it just got to the, I mean, it just gets to abuse so quickly, like it's freaky, so freaky. Yeah, we could do a whole episode on that, to be honest, because I
Literally.
have like a whole obedience issue myself, and that's really weird. But there's like a whole
Yes.
male's perspective on that too, I think, and just my own personal experience. But that whole authority thing and how you respect authority and everything, that's yeah, that's so huge. So I didn't
Who
mean to derail you
do
there.
you guys think this podcast is for?
So here's a couple conversations I've had, and one of the reasons that I want to do this podcast and some resources that I'm trying to work on producing. I've had multiple conversations with pastors who say, Nate, you have a really great perspective as an alumni of a homeschooler. I said, I was never a homeschooler. I'm not in that world. How do I shepherd these people? Because they're coming in and they want to have their co-op of 300 or so people in my church. And they have this really different perspective on what they're taking out of the Bible. And all I get for feedback is positive, positive, positive. And not that
Oh,
they're specifically wanting to know the negatives, but they're saying, hey, can you give me the other perspective on this? And so I'm going to be sending this to some of these pastors that I've met. I'm going to say, hey, listen to this episode. This could be a really good thing to think about when you're counseling somebody, when you're looking for signs of abuse, or you think that there might be some abuse in there. This is where these are some areas you can look at because it's there. It really is there. I'm not saying it's all there, but there's some danger signs that we need to recognize. And I want to produce, like I've been asked to produce, like what are the 10 signs of like abuse from within homeschooling or abuse of power and things like that, and trying to hash some of that stuff out. I think it's really important for church leaders to really get a better perspective on that. And this would be one of my purposes of why, because as
mm,
um I'm on a sabbatical, but I was in church leadership, and this is a really interesting perspective. I was able to bring to church leadership on the homeschool or like more fundy
mhm.
uh, perspective that people kind of miss because like, oh, they're fundamental, they must be really good, or they're homeschoolers, everything must be hunky dory, and maybe, but they're still fallen people. They're still sinful people doing bad things. And how do we really shepherd through that and everything? And there's a lot of missed things in that. So that's really, I think that's a great audience it's for. I think this can be for alumni. I'm deeply concerned about alumni who have chosen to homeschool their children.
Mm,
And it's not because I don't think that you're capable of doing it. It's not because I don't think that you should necessarily do it, but I think that you need to look for a couple of dangers in that.
yeah.
I don't know the type of education that they had. I know the education I had. I do not think I am educationally prepared to be able to help my children get
Mhm.
educated based upon the
Yeah.
education I got. Now, I did marry a school teacher, which helps me, but the more she says she knows, the less we actually know.
That's fair.
The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And,
You marry your wife so she could teach your homeschool kids?
I did not. And that's a great conversation that we had. And I pause, sidebar, maybe cut this. She could be a great guest at some point to bring those educational aspects to it because of some of the degrees and stuff she has. And then she's married to me, so you might just want to pick her brains and what the heck is wrong with this guy. um, but yeah, I just think that alumni who have a full, 12-year homeschool education really need to consider the danger that could be there of generational homeschooling and kind of what information is being lost in that educational system.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I guess it depends on what you're trying to educate your kids on, and that's a whole thing. Uh, But so I think homeschool alumni, I think church leaders or anybody who's trying to lead anybody, this can be so, so important to, or anybody just looking into homeschooling in general. Like, should I homeschool my kids or how am I going to help them? I'm hoping that we can be a resource and
Yes.
not just some social media like firestorm of, and we're trying to get lots and lots of likes, which please like and subscribe. Tell your friends.
Clickbait titles and what have you.
100% we're going to do it all, but we want it to actually be a resource. So we've got books on that. So, Krista.
I think for me, I definitely want to, I think I always bring up women, but I think especially it's been something that's been on my mind ever since I graduated, which was just like other women like me. Because I think, like what Nate just said, people that were homeschooled from our Fundy community are now homeschooling. And so there's thought processes that are being handed through the system here. And I know that homeschoolers can be fantastic workers and fantastic leaders, and they can be really good at speaking. And so people just assume that they have, like, they've got it. But there's thought processes that get reprocessed over and over and over again. And it's really concerning when it comes to especially young women, because you're going into the workforce with, like you said, this need for, I need to obey, I need to sacrifice, and if I sacrifice, God's going to bless the workplace that I'm working in,
Oh man.
right?
Oh man.
And
Yeah.
and here's the thing, in a way it works because a lot of it you carry on your back, but it then pours over into like our marriages, which was something that Justin and I went through, which was, even though he's not homeschooled, it took us a long time to realize that I was carrying the large mental load of the family. I remember we had this conversation at one point, about a year and a half after we had Riley, where I said, I feel like I can't ask you for help because to me, everything that I was taught is that this baby is it's almost like it's my fault. Like,
Yeah.
I made it, so I need to feed it and change it and stay up with it. Like, because that's what I saw and that's what
Yeah.
I was taught. Many times my education was put on the sidelines for younger siblings or household duties or making dinner. There was so much that got sidelined. Even when I was going to college, there's several occasions in which my parents were like, you need to come home and leave class and do this or what. Like, oftentimes it was sidelined for the bettering of the family, and or the bettering of the community, the bettering of the workplace. And so this gets perpetuated over and over again. And so I feel like it's really dangerous because if we don't root that out, we're just going to keep, well, like, like Nate said, what are we actually doing? What are we educating? Are we educating on history? Are we educating on thought processes? Because some of these thought processes are really dangerous, and it really is fertile ground for abuse, abuse in homes, abuse in relationships, abuse in workplaces, because especially for women walking in these positions, they are not taught to stand up for themselves.
Yes.
They're taught to serve.
Huge.
And even though homeschool education doesn't directly say you shouldn't stand up for yourself, it just never says that you should. It always tells us to obey and to serve and to work and to be the best, and God's going to bless. And so that is the only thing we're taught. So we're never really taught that we can't speak out, but we're never taught to speak out. And in turn, it did the same thing. It just taught us that we're supposed to be here for other people and other people's successes, and we work ourselves to death for it. And unfortunately, I worry about the next generation of kids that are going to go through this, because when you have somebody who's been self-sacrificing their whole life and now they have 6 kids and they're really tired and they're trying to do education and now they're finding gaps in their own education, I'm
Mhm.
not saying that like anybody, that people purposely fall into cycles of abuse, but
Mhm.
that's how it happens because suddenly you feel like I don't have these tools, and you're realizing halfway through trying to tool your own children that you don't have what it takes, but you can't go back. You're stuck. And so resentment builds toward your kids, toward your husband, and towards people around you. And that's how like all of that just turns into like a boiling teapot.
Mhm.
And that's my big concern, is that there's so many women that don't know that they can advocate for themselves, and that
Yes.
um they can take the skills that they did learn and go out and actually do something for themselves, and that is not selfish, and that is like okay and acceptable for us to do.
Yeah.
But we were never told we could. We were only taught to show up on time,
Mhm.
stay late, do the extra, always say yes, have a smile, and that's what we think. And it just becomes habit, and we don't know anything else until one day it's like, I don't even know if I know what my favorite color is. I think my favorite color is what I was told my favorite color is. And then that's when it unravels and you're like, oh man, I don't know. I don't know anything about myself. Because I've been advocating for everybody else this
Mhm.
entire time, and I never took the time to do it for myself. And I
Yeah.
think that's where that dangerous gap is.
Yeah. And kind of to jump off of what you said, there's like this rise in trad wives again, um,
Did you
that I've
say
been seeing.
tribe wives?
Trad, TRAD, so it's short for traditional.
I've never
It's like,
heard of that.
yeah, it's like there's this whole wave of people our age, women younger than us, who are choosing kind of the traditional wife role because they think it's more old-timey, it's, kind of this old-fashioned lifestyle and it appeals to them. And there are people who are choosing to step into the kind of lifestyle that we grew up in, but they don't know some of the dangers of that lifestyle. And so, Krista, just like you're saying, it's like these women are choosing this life of service to others and submission to their husbands. And like they're like willingly stepping into that role, but they don't know what it's going to require from them and like how that's going to affect them years down the road. And so like those are the type of people that we can say, hey, listen, it's great that you want to choose this traditional lifestyle, but here are some things you need to look out for along the way. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us for this first episode. We're so glad that you came and found us online. If you're able to share with a friend or family member, we would love for you to spread the show around. Again, as always, thank you for joining us, and definitely hit subscribe and like for more in the future. Have a great week.